So, we're already a little bit into 2022 already, but given how many games release over the course of a single year, I feel I'm more than justified in putting up a top 10 most anticipated games video here in February, as opposed to January like everyone else. Starting with number 10, we have Atomic Heart, a game that's been on my radar as far back as mid-2018. Atomic Heart is a first-person shooter game which also has a strong infusion of RPG mechanics. If you're at all familiar with the BioShock games or the recent trilogy of Wolfenstein games published by Bethesda, you'll definitely notice the somewhat strong resemblance in both the general aesthetic and the gameplay, from what we've been shown so far. Very little is currently known regarding the game's narrative premise, aside from that the game will be single-player and will be set in an alternate history version of Russia, where essentially a Terminator-like revolution occurs, where sentient AI technology rebels against mankind. It looks like in addition to there being just robotic enemies, there will also be these hybrid biomechanical foes that look somewhat creepy to fight against. Even though it's been the better part of a year since we've last seen proper gameplay, it's clear that Atomic Heart has the potential to be one of the biggest surprise hits of 2022. And just as a bit of icing on the cake, not only will the game be available on both Steam and consoles upon release, it will also be listed on Xbox Game Pass on day one as well. So if you, like me, already have a Game Pass subscription, now you have an additional reason to hold on to it for the time being. At number 9 we have Undecember. Undecember is a dark fantasy-inspired action RPG game that attempts to break away a bit from the established formula for most action RPGs, which has been to just shamelessly copy-paste Diablo 3, albeit with a shinier, more updated coat of paint. Instead, Undecember appears to be doubling down on changing and improving in areas that many more casual players like myself have wanted to see addressed for a long time now. Undecember abandons the typical character class or role functionality in favor of openly allowing players to combine whatever gear, skills, and weapons they want, in order to create their own self-tailored playstyle. The combat system likewise appears noticeably faster paced than I would normally come to expect from an ARPG. The game does appear to be online only, which may prove to be a mild deterrent to those who prefer an offline solo experience, but you still have the option of playing either solo or in co-op online. In one of their more recent trailers, there's footage of players teaming up in co-op to take on some kind of world boss, which I think is going to be pretty cool, especially since the game will be free to play at launch, so neither they nor you have to buy copies of the game in order for you all to be able to play together at once. PvP will likewise be supported with its own separate game modes. I can't say that I'll ever bother playing those because my heart has always erred more on the side of PvE rather than PvP, but it's nice to know that the developers have a little something planned for everyone. I really love the art style they went with for this game. All the attacks look incredibly vibrant and fluid, and the world design contains lots of little details, creating a look that feels both grounded but also very fantastical at the same time. Undecember is already available now in South Korea. It is currently aimed to release here in the West sometime in Q1 2022, so really any day now. Number 8. No More Room in Hell 2. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more legendary Source 1 mod than the classic community-made game No More Room in Hell. No More Room in Hell would ultimately prove to be a major contributor towards creating the rising demand for zombie survival titles within both the indie development scene and also in the larger AAA gaming industry as well. While most of those aforementioned apples fell rather far away from the tree in terms of their own innovation and quality, turning the zombie survival genre into a bit of a laughingstock, you'd be hard-pressed to blame any of that on No More Room in Hell itself. Instead of running and gunning your way through endless zombies, as was largely the norm at the time, in No More Room in Hell, your focus would be on avoiding unnecessary conflict in order to limit your chances of being infected by a zombie bite. However, because of your constant need for supplies, the game created a very socially driven tactical experience that even now, over a full decade after the fact, most games cannot and have not managed to replicate. While No More Room in Hell 2 has been in development for quite a few years now and even went through a full engine change, abandoning Source 1 in favor of Unreal Engine 4, it is finally set to release, appropriately enough, on October 31st, 2022, on Halloween itself. Where this sequel differs from its predecessor is not only in its visuals, but also the deliberate decision to abandon the strictly linear map design in favor of partially randomly generated map layouts. While each map will have its own unique visual design, and certain aspects of the design will remain consistent across all playthroughs, the developers have indicated that many of the points of interest and the paths to get to them will be different in every playthrough. with the goal being to incentivize players to stick together and make tough choices as a group, and risk going off the right path, rather than allowing longtime players to memorize the correct route. The zombie AI itself is also expected to receive quite the redesign, to make each encounter far more difficult and hopefully scary for the players. The developers have also declared that, as was the case with the first game, they intend to expand upon the game over time during its initial early access period, based on community feedback. Additional PvE and PvP modes are in the development pipeline, as is Steam Workshop support, so it sounds like however you prefer to embrace your zombie survival experience, No More Room in Hell 2 should have you covered. The developers are certainly talking up the game. Now, we'll just have to wait and see whether it meets those lofty promises, but I remain optimistic. Number 7. The Outlast Trials is one of those games that I don't think any of us really expected to actually be a thing, but believe it or not, that does appear to be the case. Outlast up till this point has consistently remained an offline single-player story-driven horror experience. I know most of the internet at the time had a huge fascination with the original Outlast game when it was released back in 2013, but for me I never found blood and gore in of themselves to be all that particularly scary, and it seemed like in large part that's all Outlast 1 really had going for it. Aside from the all-too-frequent jump scares that were all the rage during that edgy 2010 horror game generation. Outlast 2, I felt, took a decent step in the right direction by doing something altogether different, though it still had its fair share of faults too, mainly being that it tended to have way too many purely scripted chase sequences, where you just run from A to B faster than the person chasing you. I'm very curious to see how the developers over at Red Barrel Games plan to replicate that same terrifying experience in a multiplayer capacity. As we'll get into later with one of the other games on this list, it is incredibly hard to make a horror game so scary that even the presence of other players doesn't completely negate that dread. Very few co-op horror games are able to pull that off. Hopefully, the Outlast Trials will be another instance of that. I'm anticipating we're going to get another gameplay trailer with a release date rather soon, but so far all we know is that the game is still set to release sometime in the first half of 2022. Number 6. As some people who have watched this channel for a while may know, I was a big fan of Paragon, the third-person MOBA that was sadly ultimately shut down prematurely by its developer and publisher Epic Games, due to the unexpected explosion in popularity of their newest game, Fortnite. While Epic went out of its way to make the unprecedented move of then granting open access to the entire game's assets, with the only real condition being that games produced using those assets had to be made using a real engine, thus allowing Epic to profit from any commercial release of those games utilizing Paragon's assets, which was a perfectly reasonable request. Not many of these Paragon spin-offs and clones have, as of yet, made it across the finish line. Currently all we've seen is that failed abomination of a game, Fall. That said, I was recently invited by the developers of Predecessor, another Paragon-inspired game, to check out the game during an open beta, and I had an absolute blast while playing. In the average match of Predecessor, 10 players are divided into 2 teams, with each player selecting their chosen hero at the start of the match. No 2 heroes are exactly the same. Each hero has their own unique abilities and design, ensuring there's a hero to match everyone's style of play. Following the usual MOBA genre tropes, heroes can level up by completing certain objectives in order to collect XP and gold. These objectives can include eliminating minions, towers, or enemy heroes. As you collect more gold, you can buy items from the shop that allow you to upgrade your heroes in interesting ways, like allowing them to teleport to new locations, go invisible, freeze time, etc. You will also be able to purchase items that allow your hero to become more powerful by improving your various character attributes such as power, attack speed, health, and so on. If there's any Paragon-inspired third-person MOBA that has a chance to succeed and should succeed, its Predecessor. The game currently does not have a specific release date, but given the mostly finished state it appeared to be in when I last played it, I'd be highly surprised if we didn't see this released by sometime Q2 of this year. Next at number 5 is a game that probably shouldn't require any explanation whatsoever, but I'll give one anyway. Destroy All Humans 2, Reprobed. Reprobed is the upcoming remake of the original Destroy All Humans 2 game back in 2006. I can't say I ever played the Destroy All Humans games originally, despite having grown up with a PS2 at home, but I quite enjoyed the ridiculous cartoony over-the-top art style and sandbox destruction gameplay flow of the remake. The first remake was probably one of my favorite games of 2020, and I'm really looking forward to once again submerging myself in the absurdist humor of this sequel remake. The game is expected to launch not only on PC, but also the next generation PlayStation and Xbox consoles as well on day one. Current-gen consoles like the PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch will not receive ports of the game, as the developers have said that due to the greatly increased scale and density of the game's sandbox environments, current-generation systems would struggle to run the game at an acceptable resolution and frame rate, and the amount of downscaling required in order to create current-gen console-compatible ports would significantly compromise their vision for a consistent high-quality player experience. Whether you believe that's the case or whether the developers were merely just seeking out a reason to not put in the additional weeks or months towards properly optimizing the game for more than a meager handful of platforms is entirely up to you. Either way, I look forward to vaporizing more humans and committing more wanton destruction when the game inevitably launches later this year. Marking the number 4 slot is LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga. I grew up in large part playing the earliest LEGO games like LEGO Island, LEGO Racers, and LEGO Soccer Mania, and they were all phenomenal games that I adored playing. Well, maybe not so much LEGO Island, but I digress. But it was the LEGO Star Wars games that really got my attention. Between LEGO Star Wars 1 and 2 and the more refined compilation game LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga, I think I probably put in hundreds, if not 1,000 hours, completing each level, attaining true Jedi mastery by collecting all the necessary amounts of currency, and collecting all the secret collectibles. Lots of collecting, really. The problem is that, and some diehard enthusiasts might vehemently disagree with me, the LEGO games have kind of taken a steep decline in both the quality of their gameplay and the creativity of their humor, which traditionally have always been the two main pillars that hold up these games. LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga appears to finally be significantly shaking up the formula from the ground up, abandoning the usual LEGO game template of traditional standalone linear story levels accessible via a small, single, centralized hub, in favor of creating not one but a multitude of mini open-world environments for players to explore and interact in, taking full advantage of one of the things that makes Star Wars so special as an IP. Its very wide universe of visually unique and intricately designed locations, alien races, and factions. Combine that with its new, almost God of War-inspired third-person camera system, which lends a new perspective to the player, and the fact that players now have to freely aim their blasters or lightsabers without the aid of an automatic lock-on aim assist component, and my personal favorite addition being that players can once again enable the classic LEGO mumbling, as opposed to being forced to listen to the poorly imported generic film audio clips. The Skywalker Saga is positioning itself as potentially being a once-in-a-generation LEGO game that appears to be addressing many of the long-standing player complaints about the various gameplay mechanics that have gone mostly unaddressed for the better part of 2 decades. One of the only things that holds me back from ranking this game higher in my list is the fact that, as has been the case with the other prior LEGO games, the developers and publisher still will not be supporting any form of online co-op. While community mods and workarounds do exist, it's almost unthinkable to me that in the current year where so many of us are still forced to limit our contact with friends and family due to, the current circumstances, that this game, which is inherently designed for 2-player co-op, will not implement the necessary netcode to allow players to host their own private lobbies in order to play with a friend or a family member. It's one thing if the developers and publishers just didn't want to offset the cost of paying for dedicated hosting themselves, but at least don't spoil the fun for the rest of us trying to connect and build up some quality time together. There's still some time to rectify that post-launch, but I doubt it. Before we move on to my final top 3, I want to quickly run through a few honorable mentions. The 2 factors that determined this list were primarily whether the game just didn't have a set 2022 release window, or number 2, even if it did, was I just not as excited to play it as the others on the list. First up, we have Midnight Ghost Hunt. In recent years, we've seen an explosion in both the demand for and the distribution of prop hunt-themed games, and Midnight Ghost Hunt is no exception. One group of ghost hunters attempts to eliminate another team of ghosts in this PvP match-based environment. For the record, I have received a playtest copy of the game from the developers, but as I subsequently discovered the game was hidden behind the iron curtain of a NDA, I decided to hold off playing it. The developers have been very secretive, almost to the point of lunacy about this game, but the game has a very colorful art style, a passionate community, and the potential to be at least a modest-sized indie hit whenever it launches in the not-so-distant future. So I'd say it's probably worth my attention whenever it comes out. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is another game far closer on the horizon, positioning itself as a standalone spin-off adventure set within the Borderlands universe, and feeling like something that might have started out as a Borderlands 3 DLC before it got a bigger budget and thus more content. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands mixes together the classic Borderlands art style, gunplay, loot grinding, and general satirical narrative tone, with a new infusion of classic D&D inspired fantasy elements, including a new spell combat system, dice rolling, dungeon crawling, and a wide variety of scenarios and in-jokes for both long-standing Borderlands and D&D fans to appreciate. It looks bizarre and off-putting, yet oddly charming, and if that's not exactly what one should hope for from a new Borderlands game, I don't know what is. Next up, we have the story of a man named Stanley, aka employee number 427. Yes, I refuse to have an honorable mentions section and not talk about the Stanley Parable Deluxe Edition. Over the past 5 or 6 years, we've been inundated with a seemingly endless parade of remasters and remakes, and more often than not, games that attempt to present themselves as some in-between bastardized mix of the two. I don't think any of us were really expecting the critically acclaimed and downright brilliant indie darling, The Stanley Parable, to be next on the redo train. Made by the same small team behind the original Stanley Parable game, Deluxe Edition will be a full remake, abandoning the now dated Source 1 engine in favor of faithfully recreating the game with painstaking effort using Unreal Engine 4. And if the small slices of gameplay and the few screenshots and stills I've seen indicate anything, they're probably going to do a damn fine job of it too. What's more though is that the game will not just redo what's already there, but will also feature a significant amount of new content as well, including new alternate endings for you to unlock. Deluxe Edition is supposedly set to release sometime later this year, but no additional details are known at this time. Warhammer 40k Darktide is setting itself up as sort of the natural successor to the two existing Warhammer Vermintide games, which I've really enjoyed playing. Warhammer just lends itself very well to being adapted into a variety of genres. Personally, I stuck to the FPS title since that's more up my alley. The dark fantasy setting, the distinctive character classes, the variety in enemy design, and the straightforward, almost arcadey level design made Vermintide stand out for me especially. And since Darktide here is made by the same development team over at Fat Shark, I'm really looking forward to seeing what they produce in this newest separate spin-off iteration. Let's just hope that on day one it's better optimized than Vermintide 2 was at launch, because that game could barely run for more than a few seconds without stuttering or crashing. Luckily, after a few patches, that mostly worked out. But its performance still isn't phenomenal, so I can only hope that the Fat Shark devs learned whatever lesson they got from Vermintide 2's launch. Wrapping up this runner-up list is of course the obvious go-to pick, Overwatch 2. I could do an entire series of videos on how poorly Activision Blizzard has handled the Overwatch IP since its launch, and the marketing campaign for Overwatch 2 is probably one of the clearest examples of this. Even now, well over 2 years since the official announcement at the 2019 BlizzCon event, there's still a ton of confusion within the Overwatch community surrounding whether Overwatch 2 is supposed to be a full proper sequel or merely a poorly branded expansion. This is of course coming in large part from the same people that keep buying Call of Duty every year, so take that as you will. Personally, I feel Overwatch 2 will be the make or break point for Overwatch as a franchise. With an all-new story mode, an entire branch of all-new co-op PvE casual game modes, a completely redesigned competitive PvP experience which strips away or reworks those modes and maps the community actively disliked in the first game, the removal of paid loot boxes from the game, new skill trees and character progression systems, and a ton of other new features, Overwatch 2 attempts to introduce more content on day one than Overwatch for the most part has introduced throughout its entire lifespan. The only potential downside in aiming so high and taking so long to deliver is that you effectively conjure into being what I might think of as the Half-Life 3 conundrum, where people set such ridiculously high expectations where ultimately anything less than utter perfection will come across as a disappointment. I'm hopeful we will see Overwatch 2 release at least in some kind of beta in 2022, but my gut tells me not to get my hopes up for an end-of-year release. Now, onto the top 3. In third place, we have Hogwarts Legacy. Again, as a 90s and 2000s kid, probably more than any other franchise in existence, even LEGO, Harry Potter has been a major influence on my life. It's in large part due to the books and films that I went on to pursue a degree in English literature. You can open up any of the Harry Potter books and read it easily a dozen times over, or 100, and odds are you'll still find certain themes or little details that you didn't necessarily pick up before. The world itself has always been inherently magical, far beyond just a literal definition of being able to cast spells. The wizarding world that J.K. Rowling created is one that will remain timeless for generations to come, and as this game proves, is one that can continue to evolve and expand even without her direct involvement. Say what you will about J.K. Rowling, I'm fully aware of how she is seen as a divisive figure on Twitter. I don't decide what games I buy based on what form Twitter's political posturing takes on any given day. She isn't involved with this game, so I see it as a non-issue. I treat the art separately from the artist. I'm not the biggest fan of J.K. Rowling as a person, but the world of Harry Potter is a wondrous one indeed, and I for one am absolutely looking forward to returning to it in the shoes of someone who isn't Harry Potter. Initially, I was a little concerned they might treat this as some kind of sequel, but it's going to feature an entirely original story, which is pretty cool. The gameplay will utilize the rather traditional third-person RPG formula, and will feature an entirely open world with a number of iconic locations from the books and films. Combat and character progression via leveling system, along with a custom character creation interface, and of course side activities and minigames, are all said to also be included, allowing you to play however and mostly whoever you want. While the specific release date hasn't been nailed down, WB Games have come out repeatedly to confirm that it is going to come out in 2022, and is likely going to release in the second half of this year. So I feel fairly comfortable in marking this down on my 2022 wish list. And number 2 is 2 Point Campus, the sequel to a game I enjoyed so much I bought it twice for different platforms. Maybe you've not heard of 2 Point Hospital, and if that's the case, I pity you, because if you're at all into real-time sandbox games like The Sims, or management games like Planet Coaster, 2 Point Hospital would probably be the perfect game for you. I had an absolute blast playing it. It's the perfect low-key casual game that offers up just enough of a challenge to keep your attention, but not so much where you have to have much if any skill in order to succeed. What really defined the game was its satirical sense of humor, not only in how it was clearly parodying the American healthcare system, but also in how it turned classic everyday idioms into ridiculous medical conditions that your hospital would have to treat, using these specialty departments. Instead of patients complaining that they feel lightheaded, you would have patients walking in with their literal head replaced by an enormous light bulb. And in order to fix that, you had to build a special room where they would pop off their light bulb head and stick on a human one instead, which is kind of morbid, all things considered. That's just one example, but there are dozens of other ridiculous illnesses as well. A university setting, I'm sure, offers an equally vast number of opportunities for the developers to poke fun at that specific type of institution, just as they did with Western hospitals. While there are certain foundational design aspects I do hope the developers will seize the opportunity to address, like the rather clunky control setup of the original game, and perhaps rework the UI to be a bit more user-friendly as well. This is one instance where overall I'm happy to say if it isn't broke, don't fix it. 2 Point Campus is set to release on May 17th this year. Easily sitting at number 1 with no competition whatsoever is Sons of the Forest. The original The Forest game, initially released back in 2014 as a Steam Early Access title, has long been in my mind as the very embodiment of what Early Access games can and should achieve, if the developers involved make the effort to try. The Forest, for those of you that haven't already heard of it, and I'd be surprised if you didn't, is a cooperative survival horror game playable in either single-player mode or with up to 8 players if you're playing on PC, or 4 players if you're playing on console. Players take on the role of a man who survived a plane crash and is looking for his son, who's kidnapped by some freaky-looking locals. There aren't many games that are able to pull off horror in a multiplayer setting. I've seen and heard some say it can't be done, but The Forest is probably one of the few shining examples one can point to of multiplayer horror gaming done right. What makes The Forest different than most of our games isn't just the terrifying, highly intelligent AI abominations that stalk the open-ended sandbox world, but the highly enjoyable, sophisticated survival mechanics and base-building elements as well. I put in close to 400 hours so far into The Forest, and me and my friends still look to it as one of our go-to games when we're looking to just go on a little adventure or waste a bunch of time base building. Sons of the Forest appears set on adding onto and reworking many of the original game's foundational elements, most notably its combat system, AI behaviors, and its lore and story material. Sons of the Forest is set to release on May 20th this year. It's currently unknown whether it, like its predecessor, will be released initially as an early access title, or whether it will be released as a finished game at launch. The developers have already confirmed that, as was the case with the first game, they are not planning to release console ports until well after the initial May 20th launch on PC. And as you might expect, that's it for this list. If you have a game that you would have wanted to see on this list, let me know in the comment section down below, because I can't possibly cover every single game coming in 2022, and believe me, there are many more games I would have loved to include. But that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. As ever, subscribing and clicking the bell really helps. I know it's cliche, but the YouTube algorithm is a pain in the ass to deal with, especially for small creators like myself. But enough said, this is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome, everybody. Stay safe and peace out.